You learned the American Revolution was about freedom, taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, brave Minutemen fighting for liberty against tyrannical redcoats. That story is the mask. The real story is about bankruptcy, default, a nation born with a $75 million debt it could not pay, an army that almost overthrew its own government because Congress bounced their paychecks for 3 years straight. The Declaration of Independence was a philosophical statement. The Constitution was a financial rescue plan. 13 colonies did not unite because they shared values. They unified because they shared creditors. France wanted its $6.3 million back. The Netherlands wanted its $1.3 million. Spain wanted repayment. American bondholders wanted their principal, plus 5 years of unpaid interest. Continental Army veterans wanted the back wages they earned bleeding at Valley Forge. The Founding Fathers were not philosophers sitting around debating abstract rights. They were desperate men trying to prevent sovereign default, military coup, and economic collapse, all at the same time. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. This matters to you right now because the financial machinery the founders built in 1790 still extracts wealth from your paycheck every April. The Federal Reserve descends directly from Alexander Hamilton's First Bank of the United States. The Treasury bonds in your retirement account operate on principles Hamilton invented to prevent national bankruptcy. The debt ceiling fights that shut down your government every few years exist because the founders created a system where borrowing is built into the nation as DNA. You cannot understand why Washington works the way it does without understanding that the United States government was designed from day one to service debt. Between 1775 and 1779, the Continental Congress printed $242 million in paper currency. They had no gold backing it, no silver reserves, no taxation power, no way to redeem these notes for anything tangible. They printed money because they could not do anything else. The Articles of Confederation gave Congress no power to tax, zero. The federal government had to beg states for money. States usually refused. When they agreed, they sent less than requested. Often they sent nothing at all. So Congress ran the printing press. By 1779, the Continental Dollar had lost half its value. By 1780, it took 40 Continental Dollars to buy what $1 purchased in 1775. By 1781, that ratio hit 50 to 1. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," entered American vocabulary as a synonym for worthless. Soldiers watched their pay become toilet paper in real time. A private earning $6 per month in 1776 could buy a week of supplies. By 1780, that same $60 bought a single meal. If he could find anyone willing to accept Continentals at all. Farmers stopped selling food to the Army. Why accept paper that depreciated daily? Merchants refused Army contracts. Suppliers demanded hard currency, which Congress did not have. This was not an inconvenience. This was an existential crisis. Armies require food, ammunition, uniforms, and transport. All require payment. An army that cannot pay cannot fight. George Washington's letters from 1780 reveal a commander on the verge of collapse. He wrote to Congress, warning that troops had not received pay in months. Desertions increased weekly. Mutinies broke out in the Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines. Soldiers pointed muskets at their officers and demanded back wages. The revolution nearly died not from British bullets, but from American bankruptcy. Robert Morris understood what philosophers in Congress did not. Wars are won with logistics. Logistics require money. Money requires credit. Credit requires trust. And nobody trusted the Continental Congress. Morris was the richest man in America. He made his fortune in shipping and trade before the war. When Congress appointed him superintendent of finance in 1781, they handed him an impossible task: fund a war with no money, no credit, and no taxation power. Morris did something extraordinary. He pledged his personal fortune as collateral for government obligations. He issued Morris notes, backed not by congressional authority, but by his own reputation as a merchant. European creditors and American suppliers who laughed at Continental dollars accepted Morris notes because Robert Morris always paid his debts. One man's personal credit rating kept the Continental Army functional in 1781. Think about that. The entire American Revolution depended on a single merchant's balance sheet. Morris also engineered the Bank of North America, chartered December 31st, 1781. This was America's first central bank. It created credit from nothing through fractional reserve lending. It provided the financial infrastructure that Congress lacked. The bank's initial capital came from a desperate French loan and Morris's own investments. It issued banknotes that actually held value because merchants trusted the institution behind them. For the first time since 1775, America had stable money, but stable money arrived too late to erase the debt already accumulated. Every American knows Washington defeated Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781. Few Americans know Washington almost could not march his army to Virginia because he was flat broke. In August 1781, Washington's forces sat outside New York. Cornwallis had moved his army to Yorktown to await British naval reinforcement. Washington saw an opportunity for decisive victory. If he could trap Cornwallis before the Royal Navy arrived, he could end the war. One problem. Washington had no money to move his army. Moving 7,000 American troops, plus 5,000 French allies over 400 miles, required food, transport, ammunition, and fresh supplies at every stop. Soldiers needed payment, or they would desert. Local suppliers needed cash, or they would refuse service. Washington's war chest was empty. French General Rochambeau recognized the crisis. He opened his personal strongbox and loaned Washington $20,000 in French gold coins. This was not a French government loan. This was Rochambeau's own money. But $20,000 was not enough for a 400-mile campaign. Enter Spanish silver from Havana. The Spanish Empire controlled Cuba. While Spain had not formally allied with the United States, Spanish administrators in the Caribbean saw opportunity in British defeat. A French frigate sailed from Saint-Domingue to Havana and returned with approximately 500,000 Spanish silver pesos. This shipment arrived in Chesapeake Bay in September 1781. It paid for the final push to Yorktown. It funded the siege operations. It kept American and French soldiers fed and equipped through the weeks of bombardment that forced Cornwallis to surrender. American independence was won with Spanish silver and French gold, not American money. America had no money. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence proclaimed freedom. The men who financed Yorktown purchased it. This created a problem nobody wanted to discuss. America owed France $6.3 million. America owed the Netherlands $1.3 million. America owed Spain for that emergency silver shipment. These were foreign powers expecting repayment. Failure to repay meant more than embarrassment. It meant no future loans, no trade credit, no diplomatic standing. A nation that defaults on sovereign debt becomes an international pariah. European powers would treat the United States as a bad risk unworthy of serious engagement. The Revolutionary War ended in 1783 with American independence and American insolvency. March 1783. The war was effectively over. Peace negotiations progressed in Paris. British forces prepared to evacuate. Continental Army officers gathered at Newburgh, New York. They were angry. Congress owed them years of back pay. Congress had promised lifetime pensions at half pay for officers who served until war's end. Now, Congress said, it lacked funds for either obligation. These men had sacrificed years of their lives. Many had lost farms, businesses, and family wealth. They watched Congress print worthless currency while their families struggled. They heard congressmen claim the Treasury was empty. An anonymous letter circulated through camp. It called for officers to take action. If Congress would not pay, the Army should refuse to disband. The letter suggested marching on Philadelphia and forcing Congress to honor its commitments. This was a military coup in embryo. The Newburgh Conspiracy represented everything American independence supposedly opposed. Military dictatorship, armed force overriding civilian government, soldiers becoming masters instead of servants of the Republic. Washington faced a defining moment. He had commanded these men through 7 years of hardship. He understood their grievances were legitimate. Congress had promised, and Congress had lied. On March 15, 1783, Washington appeared at an officers' meeting. He gave a speech appealing to their honor, their patriotism, and their commitment to the principles they had fought to establish. The words moved few. These men wanted money, not speeches. Then Washington pulled a letter from his pocket, a letter from a congressman explaining efforts to secure officer pay. Washington began reading, then stopped. He reached into another pocket and retrieved a pair of spectacles. Nobody had seen Washington wear glasses before. He had hidden his failing eyesight from his officers for years. Washington looked at his men and said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The room broke. Officers wept. The coup dissolved. Washington did not defeat the Newburgh Conspiracy with logic or threats. He defeated it with vulnerability. He reminded these hard men that their commander had sacrificed as much as they had. He asked them to trust that civilian government would eventually honor its promises. The promises were not honored for years. Many officers received certificates instead of cash. Certificates they sold to speculators at steep discounts because they needed money now, not congressional IOUs. Those speculators eventually made fortunes when Alexander Hamilton's funding plan redeemed all federal obligations at face value. The men who bled at Valley Forge sold their rights for pennies on the dollar. The bankers who bought those rights collected full payment from the new federal government. This was the first great wealth transfer in American history. It would not be the last. The Constitution of 1787 was not a philosophical document. Read it closely. Count how many clauses address federal power over money, taxation, and debt. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. This was the power the Articles of Confederation denied. This was the power that made the Continental Congress impotent. The founders fixed this first because bankruptcy was their immediate problem. The same section grants Congress power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. The Articles allowed borrowing but provided no revenue to repay. The Constitution linked borrowing power to taxation power because one without the other caused the 1780s crisis. Article 1, Section 10 prohibits states from coining money or issuing bills of credit. No more competing currencies. No more states undermining federal fiscal policy. One nation, one monetary system. The Constitution explicitly addresses debt in Article 6. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. The founders codified debt obligation in the founding document itself. This was not abstract philosophy. This was a promise to creditors that regime change would not erase their claims. France, the Netherlands, Spain, and American bondholders would be paid. The Constitution guaranteed it. Why did this matter so much? Because the men in Philadelphia included creditors and debtors alike. They understood that new nations fail when they cannot borrow. They knew European powers would strangle American commerce if debts went unpaid. They recognized that a nation with no credit is a nation with no future. James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention reveal economic language throughout. Delegates discussed commercial chaos between states. They debated inability to pay national debts. They cited Shays' Rebellion as proof that economic crisis threatened the Republic's survival. Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts in 1786. Debt-crushed farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, revolted against state courts foreclosing their farms. They marched on courthouses. They freed imprisoned debtors. They threatened the federal arsenal at Springfield. Massachusetts crushed the rebellion with militia. But the rebellion terrified propertied men throughout America. If farmers could seize weapons and overthrow courts in Massachusetts, what stopped them from doing the same everywhere? The Constitution was partly a response to this fear. A stronger federal government could suppress domestic insurrection. A national army could protect property. A unified fiscal system could prevent the economic conditions that created desperate rebels. Alexander Hamilton made this explicit in Federalist No. 30. He argued that without federal taxation power, the government must sink into a state of contemptible weakness and become a prey to the world's powers. Hamilton linked military strength to fiscal strength. A nation that cannot tax cannot maintain armies. A nation without armies cannot protect its independence. The Constitution passed not because Americans loved federal power. It passed because propertied Americans feared financial collapse more than they feared centralized government. Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury in September 1789. He inherited a disaster. Total Revolutionary War debt stood at $75,476.52. Federal debt comprised 54 million state debts accumulated to 25 million foreign loans, totaled $11.7 million. Unpaid interest compounded annually, growing the burden larger with each passing month. Foreign creditors lost patience. France had its own financial crisis brewing. Dutch bankers wanted returns. Spain calculated whether continued American commerce was worth unpaid debts. Hamilton submitted his first report on public credit to Congress in January 1790. This document created modern American finance. Every Treasury bond you own, every dollar in your wallet, every transaction that clears through the Federal Reserve traces back to Hamilton's blueprint. Hamilton proposed something radical. The federal government would honor all Revolutionary War debts at full face value, not just federal debts, state debts too. The national government would assume responsibility for every obligation incurred fighting the British. This was politically explosive. Virginia had already paid most of its war debts. Massachusetts had not. Hamilton proposed making Virginia taxpayers cover Massachusetts' obligations. States that behaved responsibly would subsidize states that borrowed recklessly. Sound familiar? This exact argument appears in every modern debate about EU debt sharing, federal disaster relief, and state pension bailouts. Hamilton faced it first. The Assumption Plan had another controversy. Many original bondholders had sold their certificates to speculators at heavy discounts. Soldiers who fought at Trenton sold their paper for 10 cents on the dollar because they needed food now, not promises later. Hamilton proposed paying speculators face value. The men who risked their lives got 10 cents. The men who bought paper got 100 cents. Madison called this unjust. Hamilton called it necessary. Hamilton's logic was brutal, but coherent. If the government rewarded original holders over current holders, who would ever buy government debt again? Investors would assume Congress might later void their claims based on who owned the paper first. The secondary market for government bonds would collapse. Future borrowing would become impossible. To create credit, Hamilton needed to create certainty. Debt holders must know their investment is sacred. Otherwise, they will not invest. And America desperately needed investors. The Assumption Bill stalled in Congress. Northern states supported it. Southern states opposed it. Then came the dinner. In June 1790, Hamilton met privately with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson hosted at his New York residence. Over food and wine, the three men struck a bargain. Hamilton got his assumption plan. The federal government would absorb all state debts. In exchange, the permanent national capital would move south. Not Philadelphia, not New York, a new city on the Potomac River, in Virginia and Maryland territory, what would become Washington, D.C. The nation's location was determined by debt politics. The compromise passed Congress. Hamilton got his financial system. The South got the capital. The Funding Act of 1790 refinanced all federal debt into new bonds paying 6% interest. The Assumption Act transferred $25 million in state obligations to federal responsibility. Together, these laws created a uniform national debt with predictable payment schedules. Hamilton then built the institutional infrastructure to service this debt. The First Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, operated as America's central bank. It held $10 million in capital. The federal government owned 20% of shares. Private investors owned the remainder. Its 20-year charter gave it power to issue currency, manage government deposits, and extend credit. The bank was Hamilton's answer to the Bank of England. European powers respected central banks. European creditors trusted nations with functioning financial infrastructure. The Bank of the United States told London, Paris, and Amsterdam that America was a serious country with serious institutions. Hamilton also established the U.S. Mint in 1792. Stable currency required consistent coinage. The dollar was pegged to specific weights of gold and silver. No more competing state currencies, no more collapsing continentals. One monetary system under federal control. Within 2 years, Hamilton transformed America from bankrupt debtor to credible borrower. European investment flooded into American bonds. Trade credit flowed to American merchants. The financial machinery Hamilton constructed enabled westward expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, and industrial development over the coming century. But this machinery came with features that persist to this day. The federal government was designed to borrow. Hamilton believed public debt, properly managed, was a public blessing. It tied wealthy creditors to government survival. If investors owned government bonds, they needed government to succeed. Their financial interest aligned with national stability. This is why the United States has always carried debt. Every president who promises to eliminate the national debt ignores the system's design. American government was built to owe money. The debt is a feature, not a bug. Federal taxation exists primarily to service borrowing. The income tax you pay every year funds interest payments to bondholders. When politicians argue about the debt ceiling, they argue about whether to honor obligations Hamilton made sacred 234 years ago. The Constitution was a debt collection scheme because the men who wrote it needed to collect debts. They needed European creditors to keep lending. They needed American bondholders to keep trusting. They needed a financial system that worked because the old one had failed catastrophically. Philosophy mattered to the Founding Fathers, but solvency mattered more. The Revolutionary War cost approximately $400 million in today's dollars. The financial system built to pay that debt cost you your entire fiscal future. You pay federal income tax because Hamilton needed revenue to service bonds. You use Federal Reserve notes because Hamilton created central banking. You watch Congress fight about debt ceilings because the Constitution made borrowing foundational. You own Treasury bonds in your retirement account because Hamilton made them safe investments. The founders solved their immediate crisis. They prevented default. They avoided military coup. They created credit where none existed. But they also built machinery that runs on debt forever. The United States was not founded on freedom alone. It was founded on a balance sheet. The creditors who financed Yorktown got their money back. The speculators who bought soldier certificates got rich. The financial elite who designed the Constitution created a government that would protect their investments. You inherited that system. Every April, when you file taxes, you participate in Alexander Hamilton's funding plan. Every time Congress raises the debt ceiling, they honor Article 6 obligations. Every Treasury bond sold continues a mechanism that began with French loans and Spanish silver in 1781. The official history tells you the founders fought for liberty. The financial history tells you they fought to pay their bills. Both are true, but only one explains why your government works the way it does today.